it's actually happening right now, of course. And so good morning, everyone out in YouTube land. We are late today for a couple of reasons. One was that I made the mistake of shutting down my computer last night, and that was stupid of me because I have a big computer that requires a lot of horsepower to reboot, and it took me much longer than expected to turn it back on this morning. And so things got crunched. I apologize that we're late today, but we're here now. And thank you all of the Zoom panel for being here. And what we do to our Zoom panelists here is we watch the YouTube chat and try to be responsive to that, as well as people think of things as we're talking through these issues. So we're on page 89 of Answer to Job, this edition, which is paragraph 734 if you're reading Answer to Job in volume 11 of the collected works, or any other place. It's paragraph 734. And I'll read the first paragraph and then we'll have a conversation about that. The book of Revelation, rightly placed at the end of the New Testament, reaches beyond it into the future that is all too palpably close with its apocalyptic terrors. The decision of an ill-considered moment may, in some herostratic head, can suffice to unleash the world cataclysm. The thread by which our fate hangs is wearing thin. Not nature, but the genius of mankind has knotted the hangman's noose with which it can execute itself at any moment. This is simply another façon de parler for what John called the wrath of God. Jordan, you want to take over?
Yeah, the herostratic too, and it's said in the footnotes too. Herostratus was an arsonist who wanted to make his name immortal, make a claim to fame by burning down the temple of Artemis, or otherwise known as Diana, the daughter of Zeus and Leto. And what's interesting is that, so then herostratic is his name immortalized as, an arsonist, so made in some destroyer's head. And it kind of reminds me a bit, the Herostratus story of the old African proverb that says, a child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. So I kind of feel like he was probably, didn't get what he needed when he was younger, and in that sense, because it leaves that burning the village down, but burning Artemis down, which is interesting. The daughter of Zeus and Leto, Diana the huntress. She's the goddess of the hunt. So in a sense, he's trying to burn down nature, as it would be. And that, I think, then applies to Revelation at the larger scale.
Right. And it's an attempt to make a major change in cultural things. So he wanted to destroy the Greek culture. And the Temple of Artemis, of course, was in Ephesus, I think, which is in modern Turkey.
Right.
And so he was just doing this act, and we're seeing this today in real time with both our former president and Vladimir Putin, who are in effect saying what Henry or Louis XVI said, which was "Après moi le déluge." I don't care what happens to the rest of you. Mm-hmm. I only care about me. And boy, we hear that from the former president a lot. And
he also then said, "Le stat est moi," which is the state is me, and that really, that was telling about, he didn't care about anybody else but, like you said, himself.
right. And so here, Jung is also pointing to something that he said on his one video interview. I guess he did a couple, but the important video interview that he did, he said, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man." And he said, we're not threatened by natural disaster anymore, not much. I mean, yes, we are to a degree, but it's a distant threat, something like Yellowstone. Well, Yellowstone blew up 650 million years ago, and it's going to blow up again. But the last explosion was the next, we may have 150 million years before it actually happens again. And so, yes, it can blow up and destroy life on Earth, but, natural disasters like that are being hit by a comet or an asteroid are pretty rare. But humanity has created the atom bomb, and so we have the ability to destroy all life on Earth. And so when we did that, I mean, what's happened since Hiroshima is that we've had this idea of mutually assured destruction, which is if they attack us, then we'll attack them, and we'll have a nuclear exchange. And scientists say that if we have 23 to 100 nuclear weapons detonated in the atmosphere, we're all cooked. And that's made everyone back off, except when you have a person like what Herostratus, who says, well, I'm just going to make my name for all time, and I just don't care about the rest of the world. And I don't care about frogs in Latin America.
Well, and it's interesting too that the whole, Herostratus piece, where there's also the omissive ignorance of the arson, so to speak, or the destruction. And that's, for example, what's articles written called the other dark matter. And sewage being pumped into the ocean that's not treated properly, human effluence actually is just too hot and it acidic, and it kills the coral. So a lot of the ocean stuff is not trash so much as it is sewage. And it's not very widely known that, think I'll put it in the ocean, it can take care of it, but it kills the coral. And then that causes the ocean to start to die. In those kinds of places, I think then we're dealing even January 6th with a herostratic kind of event where it's, the attack for destructive purposes rather than constructive purposes. And I think we talked about Jung saying the symbolic life is the meaningful life, and all this destruction is not generative, it's erosive. And I think that's important in the context of the Revelations piece here of what is actually happening, not like it's something to come. We're kind of in a preamble place where we got the warning signs, and even the Yellowstone caldera it's 30 by 45 miles, the wide and tall. It's 600 some thousand miles, square miles. I mean,
right.
That's a huge volcano. it's not something that just, will pop off, and it takes a while to fill. And,
Yeah.
but it's that kind of, that's at a percentage of the scale of the earth.
Right. And when our former president came to power, he said, well, why don't we just use a nuclear weapon to solve this problem? And obviously he never paid his dues in government. He just decided to go direct to being president, which he could do one time around. And the thing is, I've been involved in the U.S. military for my whole life, and I know what it takes to give people enough education and maturity so that they don't pop off nuclear weapons, and that is a process that literally takes years. And he came into power, and everybody else in government obviously cooled his jets on the idea of using a nuclear weapon.
Right.
But that was because he learned from them things that are normally top secret, and and therefore he realized that the military would not just do it. Okay.
Well, right. And I think there's the story there with Ronald Reagan was an actor, but he was also hilarious, and he could put a whole sentence together, and very astutely too, regardless of.
Vladimir Zelensky was an actor too. Go on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, honestly, yeah, the way he played the piano was quite revolutionary. And it's interesting because then you get the previous president, who's a former, farce of a TV sitcom. I mean, The Apprentice it was kind of made for stupidity, and for him just to, oh, you're fired. I mean, that was, and I think the control issues that go around that he wasn't an actor. He was just a really poorly put together person, if
Right.
put together at all. It's just, it's a bunch of toys rattling around with no sense of responsibility for, and I guess, again.
Right. And he never in his whole life had anybody that would say no to him, except maybe his father. And
but his father was a monster. And
his father was a monster. And so
you get him modeling the fact that no one's going to say no, and he's going to four-wheel drive over everybody, which is what, the former president does too, or attempts to.
Right. And he's gotten away with it for a long time, but but the jig's up. He's probably going to be indicted soon, I would suspect. Probably not until after the election, because I don't think Merrick Garland will want to be accused that he influenced the election in any way. So they're just biding their time, but I wouldn't be surprised that right after the election, we will see things get much, much worse for him. And
and it was
and he's got his echo chamber, and nobody's saying no to him, but culture and the rule of law is working against him, and all of a sudden it's going to bang, and it's not going to be good. Now, whether
the 22nd Amendment, you can only, be elected twice. So if he's going to run again, he has to admit that he lost last time. Otherwise, he can't, because that would be a third term.
Right.
So he's cornered himself.
Right. And so, he, except for the FBI search warrant, He hasn't seen government stand up to him before, and he's not used to that. And meanwhile, his behavior has burned through all the good lawyers in the United States, and so
no one will represent him.
Yeah, so this woman who signed the affidavit at the beginning of June, well, she's actually an anchor on Trump's TV network.
Right.
Okay, yeah, I mean, do you want a real lawyer, or do you want somebody who went to law school and is a commentator about the law?
Yeah, and even the legal cornering that he's experiencing, his stories now are put to the fact structure test rather than the popularity test of just media. Because, for example, he'll say, "Well, I declassified those documents." Well, how can you say that the documents were planted? How did you declassify planted documents? So you got to choose one, and he's basically self-contradicting by trying
and if you're going to declassify something, you have to tell others that it's happening. Okay?
Right. You don't just say, walk up to the National Library and go, "I declassify all documents." I mean, that's just not how it works.
And for them's knows, and I do know peripherally, the fact that those documents are there is appalling and really frightening, and we have no idea who has seen those documents, or whether there have been copies made of them, and so on. And that puts all of us at very great risk. And we treat them as secrets because we want people to be able to live their lives and not live in abject fear of what can happen. But some people have to know what can happen and have to have the maturity to not just pop off a nuke for fun.
Right. And the thing is, too, with the nuclear issue, there have been, I think, the number is, I know, over 2,500. I don't know if it's reached 4,000 nuclear detonations for tests, and so people don't really look to that because it wasn't done in malice, anger, or war. It was scientific testing. The problem is nature doesn't care. It's still a detonation, whether it's underground, whether it's in the ocean, whether it's above ground. It's still the same amount of radiation. So there's a piece there that's kind of quiet that I think is also another piece, like the other dark matter, sewage into the ocean. There are all these things that occur that a lot of people don't know about. Yeah. And no conspiracy theory. It's how they tested the weapons to make sure that they work. Well, the problem with that is the Earth environmental steward ethics issue. And that gets pretty sizable. And at the same time, it's not something I go barking around everywhere, because it's not going to get me anywhere. But two, it's not the right course of action for someone like me, small fry, to walk in and well, you guys have to stop this. You're screwing up the environment. And well, they know that. I mean, yeah, so surely. It's not going to change anything. So the last thing I want to do is put a target on myself.
Sure. Yeah, you have to know your place and your role in the world, and I certainly know my place. And I realize I'm a 76-year-old. 76-year-old, how did I put it? Handicapped cancer survivor. So
there you
go. And so this is what I can do. And I know that it can be influential. And so I'm doing it. But I also know that we have to have mature leaders in every level of the military and every level of government who are providing the guiding hand that allows all of us to live our lives. And if you look, if you go to the grocery store and look around, there's nobody acting out because of race. Yes, we do have shootings occasionally or regularly now, but that hasn't happened to you in your neighborhood mostly, and those sorts of things have always been going on, except back when we had 3 airwaves channels, and we watched our black and white televisions for news for half an hour every day, back in the 50s and early 60s. We were never aware of things that were happening in other communities, but it doesn't mean they weren't happening. They were.
Well, the president of the American Psychiatric Association, I think about 15 years ago, made a plea that things like school shootings and such not be broadcast anything past a region or a local area, because it induced the copycat crimes of people who were itching to do it but still kind of afraid. And they did some studies, and when they did not promote the news, then it stopped right there. And it didn't, mimic itself region to region or region across, the United States. And again, it's keeping a secret, but at the same time, it's not broadbanding grief and broadbanding this, herostratic arsonist head, in the lead. And so it doesn't posit the ideas into the people's minds that, oh, let's do this. And
okay, so I think we've chewed that one to death. So paragraph 735. I'm sorry, the fickle finger of fate got you, Jordan, because it's one of Jung's page-and-a-half long paragraphs.
My favorite.
So go ahead.
Paragraph 735. Unfortunately, we have no means of envisaging how John, if, as I surmise, he is the same as the author of the epistles, would have come to terms with the double aspect of God. It is possible, even probable, that he was not aware of any contrast. It is altogether amazing how little most people reflect on numinous objects and attempt to come to terms with them, and how laborious such an undertaking is once we have embarked upon it. The numinosity of the object makes it difficult to handle intellectually, since our affectivity is always involved. One always participates for or against, and in quotes, absolute objectivity is more rarely achieved here than anywhere else. If one has positive religious convictions, in essence, if one believes, then doubt is felt as very disagreeable, and also one fears it. For this reason, one prefers not to analyze the object of belief. If one has no religious beliefs, then one does not like to admit the feeling of deficit, but prates loudly about one's liberal mindedness and pats oneself on the back for the noble frankness of one's agnosticism. From this standpoint, it is hardly possible to admit the numinosity of the religious object, and yet its very numinosity is just as great a hindrance to critical thinking, because the unpleasant possibility might then arise that one's faith in enlightenment or agnosticism would be shaken. Both types feel, without knowing it, the insufficiency of their argument. Enlightenment operates with an inadequate rationalistic concept of truth and points triumphantly to the fact that beliefs such as the virgin birth, divine filiation, the resurrection of the dead, transubstantiation, etc., are all moonshine. Agnosticism maintains that it does not possess any knowledge of God or of anything metaphysical, overlooking the fact that one never possesses a metaphysical belief, but is possessed by it. Both are possessed by reason, which represents the supreme arbiter who cannot be argued with. But who or what is the reason, and why should it be supreme? Is not something that is and has real existence for us an authority superior to any rational judgment, as has been shown over and over again in the history of the human mind? Unfortunately, the defenders of, in quotes, faith operate with the same futile arguments, only the other way around. The only thing which is beyond doubt is that there are metaphysical statements which are asserted or denied with considerable affect precisely because of their numinosity. This fact gives us a sure empirical basis from which to proceed. It is objectively real as a psychic phenomenon. The same applies naturally to all statements, even the most contradictory that ever were or still are numinous. From now on, we shall have to consider religious statements in their totality.
Right. Okay. So to understand this, and I think probably most of our viewers do understand this, but I have a couple of things to show you. One is that all religions have at their origin numinous events. Okay. Mm-hmm. And in most cases, numinous events which occurred to the human species only about 2,500 years ago or 3,000 years ago. Before that, it was a very different world. But about 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, people started to have numinous experiences. In the case of the West, Abraham, all of the Abrahamic religions point back to Abraham, and they point back to one numinous experience that he had, which was to sacrifice a goat instead of his son. And that, as my rabbi friend said, that was the end of human sacrifice in the West. Right. And so that was a numinous experience. And so Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all point back to that event. And, what most people in the West don't realize is that the Hajj in Islam and the Kaaba in Mecca actually relate to that time, because the Hajj is replicating the experience of Hagar, who was the slave of Abraham and Sarah. And when Sarah was barren, she agreed that Hagar could deliver a baby with Abraham. And so she did that. She was a slave, but that happened. And so Abraham's first son was Ishmael, not Isaac. Okay. And then miraculously, Sarah got pregnant. And so what she then did was kick her slave out of the house and sent her on a desert trek, which was very tough. And she got to Mecca, where Mecca is today, and she found a well. And that well was a, quote, gift from God, and that well has produced water ever since, 3,500 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Hajj is the history of Hagar's trip, and the Kaaba marks the well that has had water ever since God gave it to Hagar. And so when people go on Hajj, they typically will take a 5-gallon jerry can back in luggage on the airplane to their friends, and thankfully the Western societies have gotten away from blatant human sacrifice since that time. Now, we still do sacrifice our children, and the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington is a monument to that fact. But at least it's sublimated, I guess, is what I would say. And so all religions had this numinous moment. Abraham had his numinous moment of realizing that he could sacrifice a goat instead of his son, whoever that was at the time, but it wasn't his eldest son, because historically it says Isaac, but his eldest son was actually Ishmael. And
that's actually in respect of that, they said divine filiation here. That's the designation of a divine son or daughter, the filiation. And since Jesus, and it's interesting that there's a cartoon, I don't know how long ago I saw this, but Jesus is growing up and he looks to Joseph and he says, "Dad, how are babies made?" And Joseph looks over at Mary and goes, "Honey, you tell him."
Okay, so my point is that numinous moments happen to all of us all the time, except we don't realize that that's what's happening. Because I've been studying this for so long, and Jordan has been studying it for so long, I know I and probably Jordan have numinous moments every day, regularly, maybe multiple times a day. And so I'll give an example of one that happened to me yesterday. Okay, I had made a decision, for reasons that go beyond the scope of this discussion, to shave off my mustache. I had grown it because I was going to play Jung in The Analyst and the Rabbi in June, which I did, and I wanted to have a real mustache, not a fake one, when I played that part. But that activity seems to be over, because at most we can point to it and let Jung societies around the world actually just play our play in a meeting, and then the rest of us will be happy to be in a Zoom call and interact with some local Jung group. And so strictly speaking, I don't need it. However, the playwrights are working on another play that follows up the time of The Analyst and the Rabbi 1 year later. And it's actually it's actually from that time, 1 year later at the Aranos conference, that the photograph was taken that I've used as a thumbnail on the play on this YouTube channel. So anyway, I had made this decision to shave my mustache. I was literally within 2 minutes of getting up and going to my cabinet and taking out my shaver and shaving it off. Okay. And at that moment, at that numinous moment, and I acknowledge it's numinous only to me, but at that moment, I received an email from Henry Abramovich, and he's one of the two playwrights. And meanwhile, back in the back of my mind, I know that the two of them are working on this other play, and we've been thinking about whether we would do it in Confluence next year in October. And so I got an email from Henry Abramovich, and he says, look at this. The Times of Israel has published an article about the fact that the Jewish community of 100 people in Helena, Montana, has repurchased the synagogue that they had given up in 1935. The 100 Jews in Helena has repurchased the synagogue so that it could be a center of Jewish thought in the state of Montana. And he gave me this long article about it. And in the article, they actually mention repairing the world, which is Tikkun Olam, and it has a main feature in the play that we did in June. Okay. And so he was just pointing out this article to me. But to me, seeing that and knowing all the things that have gone before, I said, I instantly came to the numinous conclusion that I should not shave off my mustache. And so I was literally about to do it, and I didn't do it. And the only reason I didn't do it was because Henry at that moment had sent this email. And moreover, the article mentions Tikkun Olam, which was a central feature of the play that we performed in. And so for that reason, I kept it.
Well, that's a really beautiful example of the fact that with numinous events, reasons are always unreasonable. You don't need any. It's the deep knowing that strikes that is itself both a noun and a verb, and you know exactly what to and not to do, and it makes it simple, because it's I guess that it goes back to that symbolic life. It's a meaningful life, and that's because it's generative. And so at that point, you're about to, shave off your mustache, and you get the email from Henry Abramovich. It just changes your perspective. Doesn't matter why.
Entirely.
It happened. And I think that's the important piece. And I think a lot of that goes with, like as Jung is going through here with the agnosticism and rational thinking, and then metaphysical this or that. And I think there's a lot of people aren't comfortable with the not knowing. Yeah. And I think the not knowing is one of the most important parts of the creative drive, because life wells up and you direct it, and that's into art or life or what have you. But the comfortability with the not knowing, and then symbols, they need no words, right. And so that's, I think, important to bring that visual piece of the numinous in as a decision maker.
Right. And so I'm not saying that that was a religious moment whatsoever. It was religious for me, but I don't claim it should be religious for anyone else.
Right.
And but later on in this book in 746, which is we're close to, we're only 10 paragraphs away from it, but I just want to bring up the idea. Jung says something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If that does not happen, the process of individuation nevertheless will continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward the inescapable goal, which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. Okay,
Right.
so this is it is exactly what I'm talking about in this experience. Something empirically demonstrable happened, okay, comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. Now, it wasn't because Henry wanted me to not shave off my mustache. Strictly speaking, I could shave it off now and not start growing it back until next August and still perform Jung in the new play. So it's not that, but it's the fact of the synchronicity of me about to get up from my seat and walk in and get my clippers.
Yeah.
and Henry Abramovich sending me an email, which very rarely happens. It happens, but it rarely happens. And by the way, Murray and Henry did do a debrief with us on the play last Monday, which is on this YouTube channel. I urge you to watch it. It is a fascinating discussion. And the surprising thing is that at the end of it, Tim surprised me with a portrait of me, and that portrait is Jung inhabits Skip. And so he's taken a photograph of Jung that is a very famous photograph of Jung and morphed my features into it. It's a brilliant piece of
Yeah, it really was.
Of artistry. So it's worth taking a look at, if only for that.
Well, it had that Jung's happily furrowed brow in the grimace. Then that's just his version of focus. He's got this. The brow is furrowed. He's not confused. He's actually rather happy. He's like, he's got this grimace too, because he's looking at everything.
Yeah. Right. So there's, and that was a complete surprise. And I think Tim did it as a surprise because he wanted to see my reaction to it in real time.
Yeah, real time, yeah.
And so we got that. But anyway, but this numinous issue is an incredibly important point. And so everyone needs...
I think that last sentence, from now on, we shall have to consider religious statements in their totality. Then you going into the numinous piece, which is the counterpart to the rational piece. And what happens then, we need the both and. I mean, the eros and the logos, the both and it's not an either or. So instead of having to choose, it's symbolic, it's generative. rather than erosive or, checking something off on a grocery list with just, if it's all rational, that's limiting, because then the list will just tell you more about the person who made the list than about any kind of things you're going to learn.
Right. And mind you, it's my position that we live our lives on the irrational side of the world. Okay, we have structure in our civilization in every way but loose, and our libraries are full of books that are structure, and if you want to understand a topic, you can go to the library and you can get that structure in any topic, and it will inform you. I mean, you can inform yourself to be a physicist in a week, maybe. But the reality is that then you have to go out and live your life, okay? And so, what we were talking about before, the former president was treating the presidency like a library. He knew a lot of superficial things about the presidency that he liked. He liked having ruffles and flourishes played. He liked all the pomp and ceremony and respect to the individual, blah, blah, blah. But he did not understand. He understood very dimly what in terms of my metaphor. If you read a book about physics, yes, you can teach yourself to be a physicist, but if you go out and try to be a physicist, that's quite a different matter. Okay, and so we live our lives in this irrational area, which we call eros, and it's not rational and logical at all, and we have to realize that the logos gives us our civilization. Thank you very much, but you can read every book in the world about how to create a civilization, but if you go out and try to do it, that's quite a different matter.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's logic, and then there's life, and if you look at any philosopher, it's not picking the one that's the best. Each philosopher is simply infinite in their own little compartment,
right?
Their own little topic of soup du jour, their own little topic of their lifetime, right. Their opus. So yeah, it's the both. I think the both and I think comes back to that.
Okay, so we're going on to the next part, which is part 17, and I'm going to start reading because the third paragraph that's coming up is a very long one, so I'll take that responsibility this time.
Go trade back. Okay.
But sorry, maybe I'll read it. So I'll read. This is paragraph 736.
You want me to read what? Get some water?
Well, just let me get a drink here. Okay. Let us turn back to the question of coming to terms with the paradoxical idea of God. Yeah, you better read. I'm sorry.
You got it. That's right. Let us turn back to the question of coming to terms with the paradoxical idea of God, which the apocalypse reveals to us. Evangelical Christianity, in the strict sense, has no need to bother with it because it has an essential doctrine. It has as an essential doctrine an idea of God that, unlike Yahweh, coincides with the epitome of good. It would have been very different if the John of the epistles had been obliged to discuss these matters with the John of Revelation. Later generations could afford to ignore the dark side of the apocalypse because the specifically Christian achievement was something that was not to be frivolously endangered. But for modern man, the case is quite otherwise. We have experienced things so unheard of and so staggering that the question of whether such things are in any way reconcilable with the idea of a good God has become burningly topical. It is no longer a problem for experts in theological seminaries, but a universal religious nightmare, to the solution of which even a layman in theology like myself can, or perhaps must, make a contribution.
Right. And so it's a question of us getting our mind around what the difference is between 21st century human beings and people in Abraham's time or Job's time or Christ's time. And the point is that evolution works in myriad ways. One of those myriad ways is that our psyche is developing. Now, I don't mean by psyche the brain and the chemicals that are flowing around here in the head. There is something else that is quite real. We're going to be talking about it in more detail in the next few paragraphs. We only have 21 more paragraphs to go in the whole book. But the psyche is quite real, even though nobody can touch it. Brain scientists can put electrodes on you and they can see what part of the brain is being activated at any given time. And they experiment by doing all kinds of things which cause parts of the brain to light up with their instruments. But in point of fact, that's all they can do. And they have no clue about what's going on in that brain, and they have no clue about what the life experience of that individual person is and how that relates to the rest of us in the world. And for that, one needs psychology, specifically Jungian psychology, because Jungian psychology is experiential as opposed to entirely rational, which is what Freudian psychology does. So now in our mental health field, for various historical reasons that I won't go into now, Freudian psychology has basically taken over the mental health realm. And so there's this DSM, which defines all the mental diseases and defects that might appear in a person. And, people can go in and see a psychiatrist and you get this, and then they write a script for happy pills or whatever it is that is necessary. And they think that addresses mental health, but it doesn't even touch it, because your mental health is entirely dependent on what's going on at depth in your psyche. Okay, so they can treat things at the superficial symptomatic level, but they don't know, they don't treat what is at depth, which is what Jungian analysts do. And
it's medication before investigation. And medicate, then investigate. And it's as if a hunter was going in and drugging all the deer in the forest, then just leave the gun in the truck and then walk up and knock them over, because they're all just la la land. The thing is, you are inherently modifying, distorting, or otherwise changing the baseline actual condition of the psyche by adding the pharma pieces.
Yeah.
And as Brian aptly pointed out last week, I think some people, medication is probably required, but
Absolutely. I mean,
not at the level of everyone is so people. I mean, I'll take like garlic extract or olive leaf extract, supplement or something, but pills are, I mean, I don't even have aspirin in my house. And the last time I did, someone said, Jordan, this expired in 1983. I said, well, it's just sculpture in the medicine cabinet. I mean, but I think what's interesting is people are so accustomed to, there's a pill for that. And, it's
Yeah.
strange to me how dependent on someone else, and in a sense, people not rite of passaging. Child doesn't become the parent of the adult. I mean, that's kind of my soapbox, is rite of passages. And with that, what I find is that the Freudian psychology and the behaviorists, even more diet, they're like a form multiplication table, which is, pick this, that, if and only if this, then that. The Freudian piece, though, is, to me, the ecclesiastical structure in psychology that has just as much shaming behavior instead of original sin as its modus operandi. Whereas
Right.
Jungian is not going to judge you. It is what it is. So deal with it, take care of it, live with it, develop it or develop with it. Whereas, as my joke, everything Freud, lie down and tell me about your mother. It's like, well, Freudian stuff is this tortured mother. It's never a good thing. It's always this, this angry, you're ashamed kind of mother figure.
Right.
And Jungian isn't that. Jungian's more, have some unthreatened qualities, step up and live your life instead of apologizing for everything.
Right. And Jung was asked in one of those actual video interviews that he did, what was his biggest contribution? And so you could say, the observation of introvert, extrovert, or the anima, animus, all that stuff. There are many things that he introduced, but he turned around and said, well, I discovered the collective unconscious. And it wasn't until the late 1950s, 1957, that he, quote unquote, laid his cards on the table in a letter to a theologian, where he said, the collective unconscious is the equivalent of God. And some people that knew something about Jungian psychology said, well, why do you call it God? And he says, and why not? It's always been called that. It's a perfectly good name. And so, that was a revelation to me, because I said, oh, all right, now I get it, which is this, that the God that theologians sell us, the God up there, doesn't actually exist. It's a metaphor that works. The God is within us. And so prayer is not to a benevolent father up there that's going to fix our problems. It's actually a petition to our deep psyche. Okay, we each have a piece of this. It's a petition to our deep psyche to make things come out okay. Okay, but it doesn't mean it always comes out okay. It doesn't necessarily, but we have to communicate with that deep psyche, and prayer is the way you can do it, or meditation is the way you can do it. And so in terms of the collective unconscious, now if we just look at our current affairs with its sloshing back and forth, and why shouldn't we just pull forever in the opposite direction until things come our way finally? That's not going to solve the problem. It will just slosh back and forth between these opposites, and we won't have a solution, because God can be a very harsh God as well. And we have things in our society that, even today, the jury's out. We don't know what Kim Jong-il will do, or Kim Jong-un will do, that is irrational. We don't know what Putin will do with the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, for example. That could have a horrible, evil outcome, not only for Ukraine, but if the wind shifts, it can happen for Russia too, although it'll probably go toward Scandinavia, as it did when the place in Kyiv blew up back in Chernobyl happened. Okay, so when Chernobyl happened, the fallout came to Norway and Finland, and it was they that blew the whistle on it, and the Russians were trying to hush it up. And so, we'll hear about it because people are realizing there's a problem that are outside of a controlled country. And so, when I was a teenager, we had a song that was folk song that was done by the Kingston Trio, called the Merry Minuet. And the words, the first words of it, there are hurricanes in Florida and Texas needs rain, blah, blah, blah. They're rioting in Africa. They're starving in Spain. There are hurricanes in Florida and Texas needs rain. The whole world is festering with unhappy souls. But we know for certain that some lovely day, someone will set the spark off and we will all be blown away. Well, okay. That was in the mid 1950s, and nothing has changed. If you don't know the Merry Minuet, I urge you to look it up on YouTube. It's the Kingston Trio, the Merry Minuet, and it's quite real in terms of its diagnosing Western society, and that was 70 years ago.
Yeah. And, it's interesting to clarify too, you're noting of the prayer as a petition to the deep psyche. It's not a childish petition-y, adult version of Santa Claus. I want a pony, please, dear God, please, I want a pony, amen. It's not that. It's not petition-y that way. And it's like, I think Dr. Larry Dawsey has done a lot of work on the power of prayer. And then coupling his work with Alan Watts, you kind of get the breath itself as prayer. That's the wind of God, the air that we breathe. That's the breath as prayer. And is that makes for a life-affirming spirituality, where then that petition to the deep psyche, as you put it, it's not a grocery list. It's the direct communication with that kind of petition, rather than being petitioning. It's not asking for permission. It's making a direct communication.
Right. And so it does have an effect on the collective unconscious. And so if a lot of people are praying for people that are trapped in a mine in Thailand, for example, it can make a difference. It can move a society to save them as they were saved. And the miners in Chile, for example, we get people all over the world praying for them, and it moves governments. And it's unconscious, okay? It's the collective unconscious having an effect on what's actually happening on your TV screen. But it's also God, because God can also decide to ignore that plight. And go ahead.
I was gonna say, and here in Answer to Job, we see very clearly the unconscious quality of God that is actually consciously implemented by the sons, as it were. And this has reminded me a lot of how nature, we are part of nature, and how if civilization, a city, a town, gets disconnected from nature, it's too urban. And what happens is that civilization then creates uncivilized behavior, because then there's an agitation unconsciously, I think, at the lack of being in nature, as if we're fish out of water, so to speak, or person out of forest, as it were, or desert, or wherever. But with that, I think in mind, it reminds me a lot of how nature is connected to nature. And the development pieces, I saw it was a couple months ago, a documentary called The Life of Fire. And it was about an hour long, about the specific ecosystems of animals and plants that develop and grow only around volcanoes. Like where an island itself, the island is pretty much one volcano, not inhabited. And what's interesting is there was this breed of octopus around this one particular island, and the name's skipping me, but they never were crushed by the rocks dropping into the ocean from the volcanic explosions when the volcano erupted.
Mm-hmm.
And so they started running all these tests to figure out, well, fish are getting crushed and killed just because they're in the water, and then these huge boulders, dropping through and just killing the fish. Well, the octopuses never got crushed. And what they realized is that exactly to the millisecond, 30 seconds before an eruption, there was a 4 kilohertz frequency of sound that the octopi, they could perceive, they could hear that. And the fish, 5 kilohertz was the lowest they went. And so what happened is, at that point, the octopus would take a 278 or so, this exact number of feet every time, swim over 30 seconds. And that was the outside range of where the rocks dropped. And they would sit there and wait for the eruption to finish and wait for the 4 kilohertz piece to leave. And then they would go back, and it would be like this buffet. They don't have to hunt the fish. The fish are all there, provided like a buffet for them. But it was interesting to me of how that the octopus, the nature connected to nature, that it had developed the hearing just 1 kilohertz below all the other surrounding, sea life. It didn't just survive, it thrived, because it would just move out this exact number of feet, be safe, and then come back. But I think this applies here, where there's that unconscious piece where no matter what they were doing, that sound goes off and they move. So, they are conditioned naturally, as it were.
Okay, so now I have to speak about something that's happening on YouTube. I want to give a warning to Operation Brain Break here. We do not encourage the use of pharmaceuticals and what we would call drugs and opioids on this YouTube channel. I'm going to remove the comment that you made, and everybody who's now watching on YouTube can see it, so that they understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to remove the comment, But if you do it again, you will be banned from this YouTube channel, and you can take your individuation somewhere else. So be very careful. There's no appeal from this, from my point of view. So I'm now going to remove only that comment, and if it happens again, you're gone. Okay. So now, Jordan.
Yeah, back to, we're not medical professionals. One, we don't subscribe to, suggesting chemical modification or, taking anything. And in fact, quite the contrary. I think what Skip and I do here is look at how you can direct your own personal psychological development through Jungian psychology, and you are the master of your own domain in that way, where it's on you to individuate, to self-develop your psyche, and not to make it this ecclesiastical place where you're not good enough. To me, you're already always complete wherever you are, never finished, lifelong. And I think that even in answer to Job here, Skip and I are discussing back and forth, not just to apply to modern society and current events, but also how these things function in a very mundane way daily that are often overlooked, I think, as the importance of them, that can actually be of a great benefit to anyone, frankly.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to read the next paragraph. I will try to do the one after it. I think I would like to get through both of them because they're germane to what we've been talking about, but I'm not sure we'll be able to, because the next one after that is quite long, but and I don't know if my voice is going to hold up, but
why don't I read just 737 and 738 together? I mean, because your throat, I get it, because it feels like a sentence or two in, and it starts to. I don't mind. I had plenty of.
All right. Well, why don't you read 737 first? We'll do a stutter step, and then you can do 738. So 737.
I tried to set forth above the inescapable conclusions which must, I believe, be reached if one looks at tradition with critical common sense. If, in this wise, one is confronted with a paradoxical idea of God, and if, as a religious person, one considers at the same time the full extent of the problem, one finds oneself in the situation of the author of Revelation, who we may suppose was a convinced Christian. His possible identity, or hers, with the writer of the letters brings out the acuteness of the contradiction, meaning, what is the relationship of this man to God? How does he endure the intolerable contradiction in the nature of deity? Although we know nothing of his conscious decision, we believe we may find some clue in the vision of the Sun Woman in Travail.
Yeah. Okay. So I will leave it to the audience to go and read the book of Revelation and understand what the vision of the Sun Woman is about. And we don't know who John of Patmos actually was. He is the writer of Revelation. We don't know whether he is the Apostle John or just the writer of John. I mean, Revelation was written 300 or 400 years after the time of Christ, and at least 300 years after the time of Christ, because it did make it into the Bible in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea, but we don't really know who this man was and how he was connected to the work of Christ, etc. And we don't know much about him at all. And so what we do know is that there was a John who wrote letters. And so those are carried in the Bible also. For example, there's a book of the Bible called First John, where a bunch of things are said. The most important one from my perspective is in First John 4:1, that verse which says, "Consider the spirits whether they be of God or not." And so the point is that spirits are coming up out of us all the time. Some of them are good ideas and some of them are revolutionary in the opposite direction. And we have to have the maturity to distinguish which idea is good and which idea is bad in all of our lives. All of us have this experience. We've all made the wrong decision at various times in our lives. And so when we have an idea, we have to decide whether it's a good idea or not. We have to really reflect on it. And so that was the John of the epistles. And I don't know when he was writing, but he may be a different man from John the Apostle and a different man still from John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation.
Right. I think, speaking to your point right there, that last piece, we believe we may find some clue in the vision of the Sun Woman in Travail. And in Travail would basically, Travail in French is to work. So that's the Sun Woman at work, as it were. To bring it into a little more accessible languaging. And the Sun Woman is an interesting concept there, because in ancient cultures, the sun was not masculine. It was feminine, because it was the one who brings life. The moon was masculine. It was husband moon of Lilith. And what it was the moon was reflective, but it didn't have its own light. Its light came from the life of the sun, the life and light of the sun. So I think the clue in the Sun Woman at work here is, as you're talking about there, where these are things that, regardless of the author and the authorship, there is this life-giving or symbolic life, the generative life. The Sun Woman at work is the symbol at work, the sun symbol, and that's generative rather than erosive or definitive. It doesn't need to be definitive. It's simply generative, and the generative qualities of the psyche and the unconscious at work. The Sun Woman at work.
Right. Okay. So let's go ahead and
738.
Read 738. And when you hear the word God, please think of it in terms of collective unconscious. Okay, because this is where Jung was coming from and writing from, was this idea of what was happening in the collective unconscious. And so when he says God, please at least think about that issue. So go ahead, Jordan.
And I'll include that in the reading too. The paradoxical nature of God, collective unconscious, has a like effect on people. It tears him asunder into opposites and delivers them over to a seemingly insoluble conflict. What happens in such a condition? Here we must let psychology speak, for psychology represents the sum of all the observations and insights it has gained from the empirical study of severe states of conflict. There are, for example, conflicts of duty no one knows how to solve. Consciousness only knows tertium non datur. The doctor therefore advises his patient to wait and see whether the unconscious will not produce a dream which proposes an irrational and therefore unexpected third thing as a solution. As experience shows, symbols of a reconciling and unitive nature do in fact turn up in dreams, the most frequent being the motif of the child hero and the squaring of the circle, signifying the union of opposites. Those who have no access to these specifically medical experiences can derive practical instruction from fairy tales, and particularly from alchemy. The real subject of Hermetic philosophy is the conjunctio oppositorum, conjunction of opposites. Alchemy characterizes its, in quotes, child on the one hand as the stone, example given of the carbuncle, and on the other hand as a homunculus, or the filius sapentiae, or even the homo altus. This is precisely the figure we meet in the Apocalypse as the son, S-O-N, of the sun, S-U-N woman, whose birth story seems like a paraphrase of the birth of Christ, a paraphrase which was repeated in various forms by the alchemists. In fact, they posit their stone as a parallel to Christ, this with one exception, without reference to the book of Revelation. This motif appears again in corresponding form and in corresponding situations in the dreams of modern people, with no connection with alchemy. And always it has to do with the bringing together of the light and the dark, as though modern man, like the alchemists, had divined what the problem was that the apocalypse set the future. Was that the apocalypse set the future? It was this problem on which the alchemists labored for nearly 17 centuries, and it is the same problem that distresses modern people. Though in one respect they know more, in another respect they know less than the alchemists. The problem for people is no longer projected upon matter as it was for them, but on the other hand, it has become psychologically acute, so that the psychotherapist has more to say on these matters than the theologian, who has remained caught in their archaic figures of speech. The doctor, often very much against his will, is forced by the problems of psychoneurosis to look more closely at the religious problem. It is not without good reason that I myself have reached the age of 76 before venturing to catechize myself as to the nature of those, in quote, ruling ideas which decide our ethical behavior and have such an important influence on our practical life. They are, in the last resort, the principles which, spoken or unspoken, determine the moral decisions upon which our existence depends, for weal or woe. All these dominants culminate in the positive or negative concept of God, aka collective unconscious.
In the footnote, psychologically, the God concept includes every idea of the ultimate, of the first or last, of the highest and the lowest. The name makes no difference.
Right.
And we as a species have been working on these problems forever, and certainly consciously for the last 3,500 or 3,000 years. And when we were first working on them, as the church fathers were, people like Abraham and Moses and then later Job, they didn't have, at that time, they didn't have the scientific method. They didn't have a rational approach to these issues. They could only respond what they could respond. And today we have the same thing where, we're still responding what we can respond, but now we're much more informed. We do have the scientific method, and we do have rationality, which we can use,
Right.
but rationality is not the end all be all, because we don't live in rationality. We live in the irrational world. And this was Jung's point from very early on. And so, he's just pointing this out and giving us the opportunity to reflect on it. And so it wasn't that he was some kook that was trying to revivify alchemy because it was turning lead into gold. No, that isn't what it was about. And the gold that is spoken of there is not physical gold, not the mineral gold. It's the psychological gold of individuation, of being oneself. And that's gold.
The raw, refined, or raw, unrefined ore of the undeveloped psyche, and mining out the gold and letting the alluvium wash back down the river or into the cave or wherever it was mined. And then you congeal, put together the gold. Yeah. And even the smelting part, burning out the impurities to then put the gold together. It's all about making these golden connections, as it were, which is a lot like kintsugi, the kintsugi of the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with gold, silver, platinum lacquer. It's better for having been broken because now it's differentiated. It has more perspectives, more pieces to view from. And instead of motion limiting scars, there are these golden connections in between the pieces, instead of, these speed bumps or hurdles or fences of scars that are just, in a sense, dead. And scar is not completely dead because otherwise it'd be necrosis, but it is not generative tissue. But these golden connections, that inner divinity, that's golden. And that's gold.
So the fact that he worked with the irrational for his whole career, and if you read the first two paragraphs of the Red Book, he states extremely clearly in 1915 that he had to put rationality aside and work on the irrational side. And one can only know something by direct experience. So, of course, most of the population doesn't have enough direct experience until they're 25, 30, 35, 40. In his time, it was 40 or 45. Now we have precocious children who are getting to it, at least in their early 20s sometimes. But most people don't have the experience to even evaluate these things until they're in what he called the second half of life. It's no longer, it's now most of life. And because we have evolved, we know things that we didn't know 1700 years ago. And so, but because he works with the irrational and did write with the irrational, the rationalists criticized him as though he was a kook, and he was a magical thinking guy, and that's not the case at all. He was a scientist. He was trying to talk about this issue of the difference between the rational world of developed civilization and the irrational world of what's in here. Okay. Mm-hmm. I mean, my point being that when a baby is born, that's a wild animal, and that wild animal has to be raised by its parents so that it can live in what we have for civilization today. That process is irrational and largely unpredictable. And many parents are very surprised about their children's decision of what they're going to do after they finish college. And I don't think there's any parents of a murderer who conceived a child thinking, boy, what we want is a murderer.
Mhm.
Of course not. And so this is about reflection. It's about all of us working, bringing the engine of the collective unconscious to the need for working on these problems so that we can evolve to a next stage, to the fifth stage of consciousness, which is what people that I work with are hopeful for, is the next stage of consciousness.
Yeah, and I
Because
think
Go
you
ahead.
make a good point there with, even graduation from college or trade school, you leave the nest of home and go off to university or trade school or whatever,
Yeah,
and you do, and then you leave the nest of that institution. And what happens then, just the word commencement, you're not done. Now you can leave all that rational stuff behind, take the tools, but start from the experience of clear thinking. And commencement is literally to commence, to go out into the rest of your life. And I think that verb is important for graduation. It's not the end all be all. Okay, now you're ready to hop on the track and run for time. Show us what you do and how you run, a kind of thing,
right.
metaphorically. And I think that's what's really important is that leaving the nest piece where, the Edible syndrome, it's not some crazy sexual fixation on the mother. It's not leaving the nest,
Yeah.
or, running out and coming back home, and instead of going out and making your own home.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's important, I think, in this whole piece with especially the Jungian, the both and. He's making the paragraph after paragraph of saying the same thing differently, more examples, different ways to approach it. But he's simply saying it's not an either or rationalistic choice. It's a both and context that you experience, that's
Right.
generative instead of definitive.
The thing that is called for here is that we all have to think of ourselves as the Colossus of Rhodes. Now, the Colossus of Rhodes was a 100-foot tall statue that straddled the harbor of Rhodes, Greece. It's an island in Greece. Straddled the harbor and was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a physical thing of the Colossus of Rhodes anymore because it has been destroyed. It fell down at some point into the harbor and is now disintegrated. But we have to think of ourselves as straddling that harbor. And so as we think of our current affairs of red state, blue state, what is called for is not one side pulling this way and the other side pulling that way. If we continue to do that, we're going to self-destruct as a society, as all societies. And even if the United States disappeared from the planet, it would still be going on. We have to think of ourselves as straddling the two sides. That's the mysterium conjunctionis, which Jung wrote about. It is the conjunction of the opposites where you have to be able to hold the opposites in your psyche and recognize that you are split within yourself, and that you're holding two opposites within yourself. And so for spiritual malaise and for our national malaise caused by our current politics, the answer is in that one metaphor, the metaphor of the Colossus of Rhodes. And we have to learn that the Colossus comes together, of course, in the torso of the statue and in the human being. We are the physical manifestation of what the Colossus of Rhodes was talking about thousands of years ago.
And I love that example. And I look at my active imagination image example is of a foot on both sides, is imagine being able to hover, float over the coastline. Now it's moving, wherever the water is. I've got 1 foot in the ocean and 1 foot on the sand. And wherever that foam lead edge, of the water coming in into the tide and going out, that's right up the meridian of my body. And I have a foot in the ocean and a foot on the sand. But the coastline's always moving back and forth, but I don't pendulum to be 2 feet in one and 2 feet in the other. I keep a foot on both, in both. And I think that's a metaphor, unconscious and conscious, numinous and empirical, except numinous is empirical. It's just not quantifiable. And there's a qualitative aspect that I find that then the numinous then is the currency of value rather than the currency of money or specifics. And so I think that's just floating on the coastline as it moves is, to me, a nice poetic image way to look at how to realistically meditate into that example. Instead of saying, oh, I'm listening with dignity and deference to both sides, I'm literally having a foot on each side. And honestly, these days, my concept of using dignity and difference, it's getting tested more and more, where I have to go, no, I will not unfriend or block that person. I need to just, that's their prerogative. Now, I don't have to swim in it. I don't have to, start conflict. But at the same time, there are other times when I'm like, no, that I just got to say no. That's too much. And so it's interesting, I think, just the dynamic of how to actively work with the both and in real life, in real time, in a way that's actually helpful to ourselves and others.
Right. And well, I'm not going to go into another example at this point. We'll continue on with paragraph 739 next week, which means that we have exactly 20 paragraphs to go in answer to Job. Especially the last 10 of those paragraphs are, cutting to the chase. But we'll do those when we can in the near future. And I'm quite proud of us, honestly, for being able to talk through our commentaries on all of these paragraphs. And
I am too, because I think we both brought similar but very different perspectives, but they're not in conflict. I mean, so I think I love the Colossus of Rhodes, and then the all roads lead to Rome. So in this sense, all roads lead to Job and the unconscious God. And I'm proud of us as well too, because the consistency with which we've been able to just pace it, and sometimes going a little faster, sometimes going slower, but it's been driving the road, so to speak, at the pace that the road is dictating. How meaty is a paragraph versus, okay, this is just a qualifier for the next. So yeah,
Right.
I agree. I am as well. It's been, honestly, this has been a great sandbox to open up the story of Job even more. And Jung actually then giving Job a voice by coming and basically backing him up, hundreds of
Mhm.
years later. But at least he has someone to say, hey, you didn't suffer for naught.
Yeah, 2,500 years later. Okay,
Yeah, yeah,
so just to tease the complexity of the issues that we're going to be talking about next week, um, I'm going to read only the first sentence of the next paragraph, which is actually over a page long or a page long, but I'm going to read only the first sentence, and
and
this will be our topic for next week. Go ahead.
and really quickly before you do, let me insert one you pulled out to highlight a couple weeks ago, where it's Jung telling Job, "Don't feel so bad. You are not the only one I torture like this all the way to redemption."
Yeah, okay. So the first sentence of paragraph 739, we're not going to talk about it now because
Right.
it's way too complex, but here's what Jung said. Ever since John the apocalyptist experienced for the first time, perhaps unconsciously, the conflict into which Christianity inevitably leads, mankind has groaned under this burden. God wanted to become man and still wants to. Okay, I'll read that last phrase again. God wanted to become man and still wants to. Okay, now obviously God did become man in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But Jung's point as he goes through this next 20 chapters is that God wants us all to become a piece of God. Okay, all to be children of God. And ironically, although the fundamentalists think we have to point only to Jesus Christ, even in the first 14 verses of the book of John, look it up. In the first 14 verses of the book of John, John says explicitly that all of us have to become children of God. Not Jesus was the first one and a very important one for generations, but now we're all called to become children of God. And so we'll be talking about these issues next week.
Yeah, and called to be children of God, who then birth the parent of the adults of God. I mean, so it's. I think that's one thing where the church is stuck, is people get stuck on, oh, I'm a child of God, meaning I'm going to always stay a child, needing a parent, instead of becoming, the parent of the man or the woman yourself at end of adolescence, and then opening up to birth the rest of your life when you commence into it.
Yeah.
So.
Yep, all good points. So thank you so much, Jordan, for your participation here. Thank you to our other panelists who are here.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for being here, and we would love it if you would also like to participate, but I understand that you may not want to be speaking on YouTube. And so that's perfectly good as well. But you are certainly invited to speak at any time. And
And I have to say that crane or ibis picture, which is such a wonderful screensaver there, that's another foot on both sides, because the ibis eyes was the bird who can see beyond, because a fish, because of refraction in the water, isn't where you see it is. It's
Yeah.
in a different location, and they can strike to catch the fish, seeing the unseen, as it were, and target at a distorted, location. And it's interesting, their feet are, on the bottom, and they basically are crossing both worlds. So I love the bird metaphor, whether it's a crane or an ibis. That's a great picture as a metaphor for
Right.
all of Jungian depth psychology, that, both, transcending both worlds.
Right. And I actually had never reflected on cranes that far before, but that picture is repeated everywhere in the world. I used to live on the shoreline of a pond that was exactly like this and had snowy egrets there, which are very much like this crane here. And it's still, that pond is still within a half a mile of where I'm sitting right now. So anyway, thanks everyone for being here. We appreciate it. This 2-hour session that we've been doing every Sunday has actually become, I think, the most popular session that we do on this YouTube channel, with the exception of our advanced reading group, which we do not do publicly. But if you're interested in the advanced reading group, I've put the MailChimp registration on the YouTube chat. You're welcome to join us and see what we're doing there. It's quite profound, actually, but trying to explain it would be, I don't know, like persuading or explaining the United States. Okay, so peace, everyone. Thanks.